When I was 19 years old in college, I had a friend named Doris. Doris had an aunt named Sister Celine, who was a nun. I would visit Sister Celine and the rest of the nuns sometimes with Doris and came to know this small collection of nuns in this suburban Kansas City convent. The idea, or some would call it a calling, to become one of those nuns began to take hold of me not long after I began these visits. The kind of convent it was made no difference at all, but rather it was the people there coupled with the overarching desire to want to live a spirit based life with like minded people. As fate or life would have it, those lovely sisters and their convent fell away, as did that particular way of living the religious life and actually the entire faith tradition of Catholicism for me. But ironically, the one thing that didn't matter at all to me in the choosing of that convent at that time was the one thing that ended up staying with me, or more specifically, the individual after whom that convent was established. That would be one Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardoni. At least that was his original name. Most of us now know him as St. Francis. When Francis was born in the small Italian town of Assisi, his mother Pica named him Giovanni, which is the Italian name for John, after John the Baptist. She was a very religious and pious soul. But when headstrong dad came back from a business trip, he decided that the name would not be Giovanni because he did not want this kid to be a man of God. So instead, he named him Francesco, or the Frenchman, named after the commercial or the financial success that Dad had enjoyed from his business dealings in France. Well, clearly things did not work out for Dad's aspirations for Junior. My aspirations to be a nun in that or any convent didn't work out as originally planned either. But what was left from that period in my life is a deeply, deeply rooted, like in my DNA, spirituality based on the example of this man's life. And one of the reasons that Francis rose to notoriety was because at the time the Catholic Church was filled with corruption, and he sort of turned the church upside down or right side up through the cleansing of his authenticity. And that's not a far cry from what's happening in our world and in our nation now, with a lot of things that people might call corruption, and maybe we could use a bit of a reset, Franciscan style. But how that looks might surprise you a little bit. There are two things that Francis said that were so unbelievable that people for centuries either erroneously corrected it or just completely denied it and set it aside. The first thing that he said was, you can show your love to others by not wishing that they were a better Christian. Well, that was at first considered so impossible that Francis would write this that they simply deleted the word not because surely it was a typo. So they erroneously corrected it because, of course, we all want people to be better Christians, right? We want people to be better according to our own idea of what is good because it appeals to our sensibilities. But underneath those sensibilities is our ego and our self illusion that we have the corner on the spiritual market. This could be referred to as religious superiority. But that way it sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? Being religiously superior. The two words shouldn't gel, but yet it's rampant among people of faith, especially if your religious pathway has been chosen by you, consciously chosen. And that very much, friends, applies to us here because a vast majority of us have migrated to here from someplace else, very much chosen. And therefore, we think it's good, maybe even better. My way is the best way. My 88-year-old Roman Catholic mother unapologetically says so. Most of us at least try and kind of tamper it down a little bit. Oh no, not her. The Roman Catholic Church is the one true church. She said it 1,000 times through the years. Well, my Roman Catholic roots brought me to Francis, and through his example, I see the wisdom in his words. You show love to others by not wishing that they would be better because you recognize the holiness in them just as they are, sinfulness and all. There's another Francis quote, falls in line with this. We must bear patiently not being good. For this quote, nobody just arbitrarily plucked a word out to make it more believable. They just simply found it so outlandish that they denied it, disregarded it, until the 19th century when a soon to be canonized theologian brought up the very same idea, which is, in a nutshell, there can be actual value in our imperfections. God can actually work with this. Now, this is counterintuitive to everything that we have been taught religiously, that God is good and that bad is to be avoided. But this guy, Francis, is telling us to embrace the idea that God could possibly welcome and even utilize our imperfections, things within us that we fear, that we avoid, that we often deny. These are counterintuitive ways of seeing things. We heard about it in the Beatitudes. We hear about it in these quotations, but we weren't taught it, at least not in the West. Maybe a little bit more in Eastern thinking, but not for us. But it does get at the heart of love. And it speaks to us. We know it when we hear it, which is the reason why we're still talking about Francis of Assisi 800 years later. There's one particular story in Francis's life which beautifully underscores all of this. All of his life, Francis panicked and loathed seeing people with leprosy. He was a well-to-do young man. His daddy was rich. He had everything that he wanted. And seeing these people disgusted him to his core. The odor of rotting flesh nauseated him. Then one day, he came upon one person as he was on his glorious steed riding through the hills of Assisi. And something within him compelled him to physically reach out to this person, but he doubted if he could make himself do it. And yet, he willed himself to dismount that horse and approach this shy, sickly man, put his arms around his neck, and kiss his cheek. In that instant, a moment of profound and liberating grace occurred. Francis received far more than he gave in that moment. The lives of the saints are always littered with these kinds of stories that make them models for the rest of us. Francis certainly has his share. This probably makes the top 10. The kiss was far from a normal kiss. It was a catalyst for transformation, a portal from what was to new and very different things for him to come. This previously despised person helped him to see within himself things that he despised and feared and regretted. His perspective on human suffering would never be the same from that moment on. And there was also intimacy in this moment. Of course, intimacy from person to person with a gentle kiss and embrace, but also an intimacy with God because he was able to see the divinity of this vulnerable person like never before. And that was a moment of intimacy with God. All of these artificial boundaries that we put between ourselves and all of creation fell away for Francis in these moments and allowed him to embrace everything as his brother and his sister. Many of us have heard brother sun and sister moon. He even called death sister death. Everything was brought to him. Nothing was separated anymore. Now, that's a great story. It's the stuff of religious legend. But it doesn't mean anything, not really, to us. If we can't do something with it here in 2025, we are far, far removed from a little medieval town in Italy, aren't we? Or are we? Let's rewind a little bit to see if we find ourselves personally in that kiss story. Do we have fears and regrets and disgusting things that we loathe? Is there human suffering in our world today that we're called to get off our horse and respond to? And then there's that intimacy thing with God. How often do you apply the idea of intimacy with your relationship with God? And as people of faith, would there be anything or anyone else to be intimate with? And yet, do we? There's way more overlap, way more relevancy here than not. And it makes me think of a person that I knew in my days of Louisville. His name was David. David was just a private citizen, not clergy, not some agency worker, but he had a ministry with people who live outside. Isn't that a lovely way? I actually read that. Those aren't my words. Isn't that a lovely way? Not homelessness, not even unhoused, which is better. People who live outside. David had a ministry with these people. And he told me that the very first step to developing a relationship of trust with these people that he was among was true acceptance. Not to change them, not to fix them, not to try to answer questions that they weren't asking of him, but just to accept them right where they were. He said, oh, it was the most difficult thing at first to do. And part of the reason is because he had to struggle with his own fears before he could truly be comfortable in this role with them. Being among these vulnerable people brought forth his own vulnerabilities. What if this happens to me, my health, my safety, my home? He also told me about an experience that he had in a hospital with a friend who turned it all around, not unlike the moment of the Francis kiss. He was visiting a friend in the hospital who had suffered a motorcycle accident. The friend was paralyzed from the waist down. He said at first his friend had a very difficult time speaking even, and his speech was deliberate and slow. And upon hearing this, it caused David a lot of internal discomfort. And his friend could see it in him. And his friend said, I'm the one who was in the accident, man. What are you so afraid of? And in that moment, again, not unlike the moment that Francis kissed the leper, David's heart was broke open so that he could see the role of his own fears getting in the way of seeing the divinity of this person in that hospital bed. And then he could see more clearly the divinity of the people in those tents by the highway overpass. David had to confront his fears and resistance to different people, just like Francis did, and just like each one of us are called to do. I know it's a challenge, and I know that many of us are wrestling now with dealing with people who are different and disgusting to us. These differences come in many different forms. I'm not just talking about physical things like leprosy. We're not talking about that, are we? There aren't simple answers to the questions about how to deal with differences and our struggles and what we loathe. But I can share something with you, something that this story of Francis is an example of, and that is, as Francis realized, all that we need is here and now. Heaven includes earth here and now where we are. If we could only appreciate that the doors are wide open in time and space between the two. People of faith are often colorblind, black and white. There's the sacred, and then there's the sacrilegious. God is good, and what's not God and good is to be avoided. But then you don't recognize that sacredness is all there is. And if there's something else, it's that the sacredness got desecrated. But inherently, there is sacredness. And it's desecrated by our blindness and by our irreverence. But if we see in color, we know that there's one sacred universe and that we're all a part of this. And Francis got that. And if you really, really do, if you really have a shred of belief that that is the case, it will bring peace to the struggles in our world, in our nation, in our neighborhoods, and sometimes even in our families. Do you remember the fun song that we've listened to a couple times? I love you and Buddha too. Oh, Jesus, I love you. And I love Buddha too. Rama, Krishna, Guru Dev, Tao Te Ching, and Mohammed. All of these people spanning all of these times and all of these religious leanings, they got this wisdom. And it's the reason we're still talking about them and singing about them. And they had the same fears and the same things that they loathed, just like we do. And so, when we see statues and images of these exemplary people, look more closely. Don't look just by it or appreciate it for some work of art that it is. Appreciate it for the work of art that their lives were and how they not only lived that life then, but they give us the invitation to do the same, to dismount our horse of fear and loathing, to get down and embrace these things and embrace each other. May it be for us as we continue down this road. Extra bumpy, it seems, these days, I know. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this. And if you want to say anything about how fabulous our main man Francis is, love to hear it.